Well, I'm the Greimel half of Greimel and Sposato, and I'd like to thank you all for having us here tonight. We really look forward to kind of a lively discussion. If there's one topic for sure that's guaranteed to fire opinions, it's probably the Carlos Ghosn scandal. It's really divisive, so I'm sure we'll have a really lively Q&A session. Let me just start by kind of going back in time a little bit here, and you can think of history as sprinkled with these moments where you kind of always eternally remember where you were when you first heard the news about some kind of earth-shattering event. Like for some generations, it might be Pearl Harbor, or maybe when Kennedy was shot, or maybe more recently it might be the 9/11 attack or the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. But for me personally, there was another kind of mega event that's kind of burned into my brain, and that is the stunning arrest of Carlos Ghosn. And then at the time, he was the legendary chairman of Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, the Auto Alliance, and one of the most storied executives in the history of the auto industry. So I always remember where I was when I heard that news for the first time. And probably a lot of you in the room do too, if you are a member of the expat business community, and maybe if you're from the auto industry in particular. Anybody here remember where you were when you heard the news about Carlos Ghosn being arrested? I see only one hand in the whole room. Oh, two hands too. Okay, all right. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just the auto nerd who remembers this. But I teach at Waseda University's Graduate School of Journalism as a kind of a night school there, as part-time for beer money. And I was just settling to my class shortly before 6 p.m. on Monday, November 19th, 2018. And out of habit, I just checked my email before class begins. And I see this urgent email from my assistant with the subject line saying Ghosn. So I clicked it, open, and I was absolutely stunned and floored to see a news bulletin in there saying that Ghosn had just been arrested, or was going to be arrested for possible financial misconduct allegations. And I thought to myself, surely if there's such a thing as fake news, this has got to be fake news. It was just too unbelievable. Or at least maybe there was like some kind of translation error or a reporter's mistake or something like that. But I made a few phone calls, and sure enough, a fact was stranger than fiction. Nissan would be holding a press conference that night at 10 p.m. at its world headquarters in Yokohama to explain the whole thing. So even my Waseda students, being Gen Zers, I guess they are now, maybe I'm not sure. But anyhow, they're pretty young and they don't know a lot about the world, but they knew enough to know who Carlos Ghosn was. And so they forgave me when I abruptly canceled class and head to the train to get down to Yokohama. So when I arrived at Nissan headquarters that night, it was an absolute zoo. The line of reporters waiting to get in was literally going through the lobby and out the front door. And there were hundreds of us crammed into the 8th floor briefing room where there was standing room only. And that's when then CEO Hiroto Saikawa, now this is Ghosn's longtime right-hand man, and he came out and he blasted his former mentor as, quote, the mastermind of years of financial misconduct while he was at the helm of Nissan. And thus began this 3-year odyssey of covering what is now known as Ghosn shock. So it's a stunning rise and fall story of epic proportions, really. And even today, I just can't wrap my head around it. It just seems too impossible to believe. The upheaval all but wiped out the reputation of and legacy of one of the auto industry's most famous executives. And it said the stock prices of Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi crashing 60% within the first year alone. And it nearly shattered the automotive empire that Ghosn spent 2 decades building into what's the world's largest, or what at the time I should say, was the world's largest auto group. And finally, it cast this embarrassing spotlight on Japanese justice system on the global stage. And of course, this whole process ultimately resulted in our book Collision Course, which we're here to talk to you tonight about. So thank you very much. The scandal, of course, continues to rock the auto industry, and it remains a subject of hot speculation and debate even to today, right? So the main question was this: was Carlos Ghosn simply a corporate crook who overstayed his welcome, grew complacent, crossed the line by treating the company as his personal piggy bank? Or was he the victim of a corporate coup by entrenched Japanese interests who framed this famed executive to prevent him from further integrating Nissan with Renault? In other words, was Ghosn sacrificed to keep Nissan as a Japanese company? So let's just take a quick show of hands here. How many of you think that Carlos Ghosn was a crook? Anybody raise a hand? Oh, whoa. And okay, a couple brave people out there. And how many of you think that he was framed as a victim? Okay, how many? Yeah. Okay, how many aren't sure? Okay, and how many think both? Okay, I see a lot of double hands there, I think, but we'll see if maybe some of your opinions change by the end of the evening here. Well, I spoke to Ghosn just 2 weeks ago, and I should tell you that he assures me that he is not a crook. As you know, he's living as an international fugitive, sheltering in Beirut, Lebanon, and he's living still in that pink-walled townhouse that you often see shown in the media, right? Nissan originally bought that house for him to live in, and it's one of several of his world residences that he had at the time, including places here in Tokyo. By that mushroom building here in Moto Azabu is where he used to live. He had a place in Paris, in Amsterdam, and in Rio de Janeiro. And now, of course, they're arguing about the ownership of that, especially the Beirut place where he's hanging out. But he was speaking from his airy study where he got a big bookshelf behind him with photos and knickknacks and other little mementos from his life, his former life as a kind of a globe-trotting superstar executive who would hobnob with business tycoons and heads of state and royalty and things like that. And his library even has one of those ladders that runs on a rail so that you can get up high and reach it like in an old-time library or a fancy bookstore. So, but in talking with him, I would describe his state of mind this way with maybe 3 words: defiant, unrepentant, and aggrieved. The number 1 priority for him right now is basically rebuilding his reputation. And he admits that's going to be an uphill battle, given the fact that he fled Japan. But he's writing books. He's participating in documentaries. He's doing all kinds of interviews. He's even teaching management courses at local universities in Lebanon. And he says he's doing consulting work and advice for startup companies. So he clearly wants to reposition himself as somebody still relevant to the international business community and the automotive industry in particular. And as he told me, quote, "I'm still in the game." So he even imagines himself as a director of a company board someday. But that might be also a tall order because under the settlement with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission that he made in 2019, Ghosn is barred from even serving as a director on a U.S. publicly traded company for a decade. And of course, one of Ghosn's favorite things to do still is to bash on Nissan and the alliance with Renault. So in public interviews today, he never fails to slam Nissan, quote, as a boring company that nobody cares about, or dismiss the alliance as, quote, a zombie. So he says the alliance itself, that this combination of Renault and Nissan, is bound to break apart without a strong leader like him at the helm. So Ghosn seems to harbor basically not even the slightest doubt about his own innocence. And he has 0 regrets about jumping bail and fleeing Japan. He forfeited actually $14 million in bail just to get out of Japan. And that was reportedly a record here in Japan. But that small change was worth it to Carlos Ghosn, because he says that's the only way that he can get out and actually tell his side of the story. In Japan, he says, he would have faced certain prison time, and what he says is the biased justice system here. So as Ghosn himself said when he landed in Lebanon and he issued a press release, he said, "I have not fled justice. I have escaped injustice and political persecution. I can now finally communicate freely with the media." And that's exactly what he did just days after landing in Lebanon. On January 8th of 2020, he invited the whole world's media basically to come to Beirut and have for his first press conference since his arrest. And I was there, and Ghosn, this great communicator, was totally in his element. He held court for 2.5 hours walking the floor, standing up, fielding questions in French, Portuguese, English, and Arabic. He was cracking jokes, and of course, he was railing against Nissan and the Japanese justice system the whole time. Now, in my recent discussion with Ghosn, he did shed some light on one of the biggest mysteries about his case, and that is, how did he manage to escape Japan? Well, as we know, on December 29, 2019, as Japan was getting busy getting ready for the New Year holiday, Carlos Ghosn sneaked out of his court-monitored home, which, just in case you didn't know, is right around the corner from the Tokyo American Club here in the same neighborhood, literally just like a 2-minute walk down the street. He walked over to the Roppongi Grand Hyatt Hotel, and he met up with a team of operatives. And leading this team of operatives was a former American Green Beret. They went to Shinagawa Station. They hopped on the Shinkansen bullet train, and they dashed immediately over to Osaka. There they checked into another hotel, and that's where they packed Carlos Ghosn into an oversized musical equipment case. Now, the most nerve-wracking moment, Ghosn said, this is when I was talking to him the other day, was that when the airport staff was at Kansai International Airport was debating whether or not to x-ray the trunk that he was hiding in. So Ghosn was scrunched up inside the box at the time, and he could hear the officials deliberating what to do. And he couldn't tell which way the decision was going because they were speaking in Japanese. But if they scanned that trunk, he'd be sunk. And Ghosn was taking a deep breath, and he listened, and he concentrated, and then the talking stopped, and then the trunk kept rolling. And only then did he realize that he had finally made it. And Ghosn was loaded onto the private jet and spirited out of the country to freedom shortly before midnight. So in Ghosn's own words, he said, quote, "This is the single most important decision that had an impact on my life." That decision not to scan that trunk. So watch for that moment to be recreated in the climax scene of an upcoming miniseries from Netflix. Should be interesting to watch. How many of you would watch a Netflix series on Ghosn? Wow, all right, good. We haven't been asked to contribute to one yet. No, it's not a plug for us, no, unfortunately. Anyhow, so regardless of what you think about Ghosn and maybe the allegations against him, I have to hand it to him just for having the courage to try to even attempt such a brazen getaway. Now, getting back to this conspiracy against him, you know, in one sense, there was a conspiracy against Ghosn. A group of 3 executives, the head of internal audit, the head of the legal team, and the head of government relations, global government relations, admitted in court that they launched an secret internal investigation of Ghosn in early 2018. And they met together actually at private lunches to discuss the matter. And then they took the matter straight to the prosecutors instead of going to the Nissan board, which would have been the normal route for this kind of matter. And they also indicated at the same time that they were against Ghosn's plan to integrate or almost merge Nissan and Renault under a holding company. They wanted to keep Nissan more autonomous. But what were their real motives? Now, in court, they said that their probe was spurred simply by misconduct and the suspicion of financial misconduct. And that they had these differences over the corporate direction and corporate strategy had nothing to do with it. To them, it was a crime, not a coup. But Ghosn and his backers, however, they say that the conspirators wanted to stop the integration between Nissan and Renault the most decisive way they could, and that was by taking out the architect of the plan, right? They say, if you think otherwise, it's pretty naive of you. So in the Carlos Ghosn saga, there's still plenty of unanswered questions, that's for sure. And with Carlos Ghosn still living in Lebanon and beyond the reach of Japanese justice, it's probably unlikely that we'll see many of these questions, if any of them, answered in a court of law. So in collision course, what we try to do is tell both sides of the story. We try to take a balanced approach, and we aren't afraid to acknowledge that there's plenty of gray areas in this matter. But still, there are several important lessons that can be learned from the Ghosn crisis, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of those tonight. So what's the status right now? Well, right now, the Ghosn saga is still playing out in courts all around the world, thanks to a litany of civil cases, class action suits, criminal cases. And by one count, there was like some 50 live cases at one point going on, all related to this Ghosn scandal. And in Japan, it's still ongoing. The father-son team, the American father-son team that basically brokered Ghosn's escape, they were sentenced to prison in July. The father, the Green Beret, Michael Taylor, he got 2 years in prison. And the son, Peter Taylor, he got 1 year and 8 months. So they're in prison right now as we speak. And here in Tokyo, the Tokyo trial is still underway for another American, Greg Kelly. He's the former Nissan director who was arrested the same day as Ghosn and charged as his accomplice. And actually, just today, the defense team made its closing arguments in that case. And William and I just came here directly from the court, essentially. We were there today to listen to it. And a verdict in Kelly's case is now expected on March 3rd. And prosecutors in his case are demanding 2 years in prison. Meanwhile, the future of the Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi alliance is anything but certain. All three companies have new CEOs, and they're struggling to dig out of these massive losses that they have. And in Nissan's case, it's the biggest loss in the corporate company's history. Meanwhile, relations between the French side and the Japanese side remain battered and bruised, and critics say that the alliance is bound to break up. Yet, despite all this upheaval, the root of this unbalanced alliance relationship between Renault and Nissan was never resolved. Renault is the smaller company, but owns a controlling 43% stake in Nissan. Nissan is a bigger, more profitable company, but it has only a 15% non-voting stake in Renault. So serious discussions on like rebalancing those cross holdings were simply kicked down the road into the future, and that potentially means more fireworks to come about this relationship between the two. And also, there's the lingering embarrassment and doubt cast upon Japan's justice system by Ghosn's humiliating escape from Japan, and this new attention put on what critics call Japan's system of hostage justice, right? As Ghosn himself said, you know, I have not fled justice, I have escaped injustice and political persecution. And for many, those words ring true. And then finally, there's the million-dollar question, and that is what to make of Ghosn's legacy now. So Carlos Ghosn is rightly credited for being the man who saved Nissan from near bankruptcy. He introduced many new business concepts to Japan, and he was a pioneer in proselytizing three major trends of the industry, kind of way before other people. One is company consolidation for massive economies of scale. Two is the electric vehicles, and three is autonomous driving, right? He built Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi into the world's largest automaking group, selling 10.6 million vehicles in 2017 to capture the world title. And that's basically almost nearly 1 of every 8 vehicles sold worldwide that year. But critics say he took his eye off the road in the later years. He became an emperor with no clothes. Nobody could tell him no. Ghosn embarked on overambitious expansion plans in those later years, and he began slipping on some of his targets. For example, he had this target to sell electric vehicles, and he missed that target by over 1 million units. Yeah. So, you know, his magic began to wear off a little bit in the eyes of critics later on. And today, Ghosn's successors at Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi are all downsizing the operations. Whereas Ghosn always said bigger is better, the new mantra at the companies is small is beautiful. And in the end, despite all of his achievements, Ghosn's official biography will always be tarnished by that shameful, non-erasable asterisk, and that is that he ended a legendary career here in Japan by being indicted 4 times, jumping bail, and then living as an international fugitive. So Carlos Ghosn landed in Japan as a legend, and he left here in a packing crate. So the symbolism kind of speaks for itself. So the Nissan Ghosn scandal is riddled with still many unanswered questions. But with new developments and information still coming to light, we can expect one thing. This sordid saga will continue to evolve and mystify and be the subject of speculation and debate for many years. And the last chapter is not yet written. Future generations may view the whole story a lot differently from how we're viewing it now. And giving all the twists and turns that we've seen in the story so far, I wouldn't rule out anything happening in the future. And that includes the possibility of Ghosn eventually ending up back in Japan to stand trial someday. So remember, if that actually happens, you heard it here first. All right. And now I'll turn it over to my partner, William, who will elucidate all the details. Well, I just gloss over the big picture. He will fascinate you with his command of all the details and the ins and outs.
I'm not sure about that, but thank you. Yeah. I'm not sure what's left to say, actually. So my role in the book, as you can tell, Hans is the expert in all of these critical areas about the whole Ghosn story. My role was to more talk about cultural issues, cross-cultural issues, the role of the French and Japanese governments, and became quite interested in Japan's judicial system, which is certainly front and center with a lot of these discussions. Now, in writing the book, these are all good topics. Coming here, it's very nerve-wracking because on each of these areas, there are people in the audience who know more than I do. So this is very unnerving to talk to all of you. So bear with me. Let me go through just a couple of sort of highlights, what I think on each of the points. The cross-cultural issues. When Ghosn got here, he really did well. You have to hand it to him. He seemed to have a natural sense for what cultural taboos could be broken to get Nissan back on track and which ones couldn't. And the success was clear. So if you look at the market valuation of Nissan from the time he took over, at its peak, it rose by $60 billion. Now, for the financiers in the audience, if you want to compare that to Tesla today at $1 trillion, that's an arguable point. How much is 60 billion? But it's an amazing achievement, right? But 19 years is a long time. So for management experts we talk to, right, knowing when to get off stage, knowing when to leave. And in fact, if Ghosn had only thought of this, of leaving just 6 months before his arrest, he probably would have gotten away with it. Because as Hans said, the group coalescing against him that was talking with the Tokyo prosecutors only started in the spring of 2018. And there would have been a real tendency before that for anything that was found just to cover it up, right? And to hide it rather than to expose it. But as he was here longer and longer, he got more discontented. He got more disconnected from the company. People we talked to, he wasn't nearly as well plugged in. Because as one person said, how was it all of this happened and he never knew it was coming? How could he not see this? How come he couldn't have heard a whisper that there are 3 guys having lunch every week in the office building, boss? And something's brewing. They're asking me questions. None of this seemed to get back to him. So it was, I thought, a great anecdote. People we talked to who used to work with him. When he first got here in Japan, Saturday night was often at his home playing bridge with another expat couple. By 2016, right, he's doing kashikiri at Versailles. Now this is a change in a man's view, right? He's now renting out all of Versailles to have a party for himself. That's a long way from somebody who thinks having bridge on Saturday night is a fun thing to do. Now, the salaries that we're talking about are not massive. If Ghosn really wanted to get paid what he thought he was worth, he probably should have just gone into private equity. And he would have done much, much better than he ever would have done out of Nissan. Now, the role of the governments has been a big issue. So Ghosn contends that not only was there a conspiracy within Nissan, that this spread to the Japanese government. And this grand conspiracy that brings together the Nissan executives, NETI, right, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and even the Chief Cabinet Secretary's office, Mr. Suga, right, who represents Yokohama, where Nissan is located. All of these people came together and told the prosecutors to go look for a case against Ghosn. So is that true or not? It's tough to disprove because it's tough to prove or disprove a negative. I have to say we didn't come up with evidence to support this? There's a couple of things. Number one, anyone who works in a large organization, think about how practical it is that Nissan, the Ministry of Economy, the Prime Minister's office, and the Justice Ministry would all get together and work on a common goal this quickly, right? It doesn't seem likely to some extent. Also, if you're a prosecutor, you're the one that's going to be carrying the can in this, right? If the case against Ghosn fails, the other supposed co-conspirators are not going to be there to help you. So for the Justice Ministry, it would seem a bit of a stretch that they would take this on for political reasons. And don't forget, Japanese prosecutors are famously independent. Now that sounds good. You may think it's a bit naive, but think of Kakue Tanaka, most powerful man in Japanese politics, brought down by prosecutors. Takeshita in the recruit scandal, brought down by the prosecutors. More recently, the Justice Minister, Mr. Kawai, brought down in a vote buying scandal. So the prosecutors have shown that they have independence. It's not clear, though, whether there was involvement in the government at other levels. And on the other side, you could argue the Toshiba case more recently does suggest that METI was getting actively involved in corporate issues. On the other side is the role of the French government. What did they do? They were clearly much more activist. And so the METI people we talked to said all we were doing was pushing back against the French government, which we felt was putting too heavy a finger on the scales. Now, from a French perspective, you paid $5.4 billion for a failing company. You think you want to get some return on that fairly speculative investment down the road. So to a large extent, it's easy to think that the French government thought, okay, it's payback time. We basically control Nissan. We get to say where the manufacturing goes, what happens in the future of these two companies, because we're the ones that put down the money when it counted. So finally, on the judicial system, Hans mentioned hostage justice, popular phrase. Japanese government gets very mad when foreign media talks about the hostage justice system. Where does the phrase come from? The Japan Federation of Bar Associations coined the phrase hostage justice. What upsets the government is that the foreign media picked up on it and circulated it around the world. That's what really bothers them. So, is Japan's justice system terrible? Is it crooked? 99% conviction rate. Not quite, but 98's not that much better, which is what the numbers that we had when you look at the number of cases. On the other hand, are other systems any better? So one legal expert more recently had a great line. He said, in a lot of the comparisons, Japan's justice system is being compared to this theoretical Western method of justice. In reality, justice systems in most countries are pretty horrible things. Long detentions are not uncommon. Improper prosecution is not uncommon. So the Japan justice system, you can argue, puts too much weight, gives too much weight to the prosecutors. And they're potentially, I think, going to be looking at that down the road, despite the idea that they don't want to accept foreign pressure. Which brings us to the Greg Kelly trial. As Hans mentioned, we listened today to the defense briefing. Now, Greg Kelly is probably a more sympathetic figure for a lot of us because we could identify with him, right? He's not a high-flying corporate executive with his own jet. He is a mid-level senior, but still a working guy within a big company who has now been in 3 years embroiled in this case. So the problem is on both sides in this trial from our perspective. The prosecutors never really wanted to go after Greg Kelly. He was a way to get to Carlos Ghosn. And they certainly didn't think they would have to try him on his own. They expected Ghosn to be right next to him. And they say, Mr. Ghosn, oh, and you too, Mr. Kelly. And here they are stuck with prosecuting Greg Kelly on his own. From the evidence, it looks a little thin, to tell you the truth. What it requires is for the judges to connect the dots and to make assumptions about things that have not really been introduced in evidence. There's no email traffic that really incriminates Kelly very clearly. The problem for the defense is this is what Japanese judges tend to do, especially if it's to prosecute, right? 99% is pretty good. 98% is a pretty good going with rate. So they are willing to say, yes, it seems obvious to us that this happened, even if there's no evidence of it. And so the trial, as Hans says, finalized today, verdict 6 months out. Why are they going to take 6 months is not quite clear, although the defense did submit 500 pages in their closing argument today. So there's a lot going on there. So let me end it there. We are out of time. What did I miss?
I think you summed it up very well and put it all in great cultural context, as always. As always. You know, regarding the Greg Kelly case, it's really a proxy case for Ghosn, as William points out, because Ghosn isn't here to stand trial. The next best thing they have is Greg Kelly, and if Kelly is found innocent, you can bet your bottom dollar that Ghosn will be issuing a press release the next day saying he's been cleared as well. So even though that's not entirely true, because Ghosn has 4 indictments against him, only 2 of which he shares with Greg Kelly, and the 2 others are basically accused only against Ghosn. So those are still up in the air. But you can see how there's all this pressure on Kelly as the representative of Ghosn in the dock, and you know, prosecutors might be independent, but there's extreme, I would say, political pressure on them to make this case stick.
And Kelly got a boost from former Ambassador Hagerty, who was doing the confirmation hearings for Mr. Emanuel and sharply criticized Japan's judicial system. I was a bit surprised. It was very strong remarks coming from an ex-ambassador to a country. And I think the Japanese government was probably a bit surprised as well. So we should move over to questions, yeah?
Thank you, yeah. So we have one already in from a virtual attendee, so I'll ask. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to line up over here. We'll go through like, oh, thank you. So from Wendy, who's joined us online, she says, Hans asked whether we think Ghosn is a rogue or if he was framed by Nissan Renault or both. I'm interested to hear what Hans himself thinks based on his research and time spent interviewing Ghosn.
Put us on just me. What about William? Why am I the only one put on the spot here? Did he go rogue? It's hard to tell. I can't really come up with a final answer on this. And partly because all the evidence is still kind of not in public realm yet. We don't have a lot of evidence against Ghosn. We see what evidence there is against Kelly, because that's been put out in public by in this court case that's ongoing. And that makes Ghosn look there's some perhaps very damaging and difficult evidence in that case. But yet there's all kinds of different evidence in the other 2 charges against him, and those are breach of trust charges, which basically accuse Ghosn of diverting company money for his own personal benefit. In one case, it was diverting about the allegation calls for him diverting $15 million into an associate's business associate of Nissan in the Middle East as potential payback, basically, for that person helping him clear some losses that he took on some currency swap exchange here in Japan. So that looked like a payback of sweetheart money coming from Nissan. And in another case, it looked like a kickback operation where he funneled $15 million through the so-called CEO account and sent it over to another distributor in the Middle East. And the prosecutors allege that about 5 million of that came back to Ghosn through other channels, basically a kickback scheme of sorts. And in these cases, we haven't seen any kind of, it's basically a he said, she said at this point. We haven't seen any of the evidence, and that's partly because the prosecutors are keeping it. They don't want to tip their hand ahead of a trial. They're hoping that maybe one day they can get going back here on trial, and they can. And that's why they don't want to tip their hand ahead of time. So it's really hard to say at this point. I'd say the jury's still out.
Thank you.
Hello, I work with a fellow named Celso Gyotoko. Celso was the global CIO at Nissan for 15 years. I think he left in 2018. I've talked to Celso every day about this for the last 2 years. He had a lot to say. I invited him to come here tonight, but we had dinner here, and then he had to go give a speech at the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce. But at any rate, one of the things that Celso, first of all, he said that he thought you got a lot of things right in the book, but there was one part that seemed to be a little bit where you didn't really have the full picture, possibly. He doesn't have proof for this, but he thinks that strongly that this may be the case. Saikawa-san was, I guess, had issued profit warnings for 3 quarters in a row. And he was, and I guess Ghosn had a history of basically getting rid of executives once they had missed a profit warning more than once, or once they had issued a profit warning more than once. Saikawa-san knew this, and that was probably a big motivation for why he stabbed Ghosn in the back after, working with him as his trusted, most trusted person in Japan for, the whole time he'd been here. So just wondering what your thoughts are on that and whether you had heard anything like that in your research.
Okay, well, I think what you're talking about is the idea that Saikawa and Ghosn go way back, basically. Saikawa is Japanese, Ghosn is French, Lebanese, Brazilian, and they go way back to basically the beginning of Ghosn's rescue attempt. And Saikawa was his loyal right-hand man, kind of almost viewed as his enforcer by some people, and they rose together through the ranks. And eventually, in 2016, Ghosn took over, basically engineered the takeover of Mitsubishi by Nissan, so that Mitsubishi was then brought into the alliance. And he said, okay, Saikawa, you be the CEO of Nissan now. I'm going to just be the chairman. And they were co-CEOs for, I think, about 6 months. And then Saikawa took over altogether. And then the performance of Nissan started slipping. And then this became a blame game at that point. Whose fault was it that the performance was slipping? Was it because Ghosn had overextended too much beforehand and really pushed into unsustainable growth? Or was it that when Ghosn stepped back had just become chairman and left the operations more to Saikawa, that Saikawa dropped the ball and everything fell apart? And then there were these rumors, too, that Saikawa wanted, or that Ghosn wanted to replace Saikawa. Saikawa and Ghosn are about the same age, about retirement age, around, let's say, 2018. And there was discussion about who should replace, who should be the next CEO after that. So there was some discussion about replacing Saikawa, and there were some other names being floated at the time. And that was one of the theories put out there, that Saikawa, in order to save his own skin, basically, like you say, stabbed Ghosn in the back or engineered this. But what comes out in the trial, and what comes out and what we've talking to people, is that Saikawa found out about it very late in the game. They found out about this investigation into Ghosn very late in the game. The ball started rolling much earlier in secret with those 3 executives that we talked about earlier. And Saikawa only found out about it in October of 2018. That's literally like a month before the arrest. And at that point, basically, they forced Saikawa's hand. It was either like, well, either we take you out or you join us and it's one of the either or kind of proposition. So basically, Saikawa had no option but to join these kind of rebel forces, if you will, within Nissan, and that's what our own reporting found in this case. So there was perhaps an extra motivation for him to join that force because he wanted to save his own skin. But at that point, I would say the ball was already rolling.
Thank you. We've got another question from a virtual attendee. This one's from Jim. Mr. Ghosn was surely thrown under the bus to prevent the further consolidation of Mitsubishi and Nissan by Renault. Why the Japanese legal system took this on and why it can't let it go as a continuing black eye for Japan. Is Nissan such a national champion that the Japanese government needs to protect it to the detriment of international affairs?
Should I try that one? There's a couple of assumptions in there, of course, which are tricky. Nissan is not Toyota from a Japanese government point of view. I would argue, number one, that they have been a troubled company quite on and off for quite a few years. And it's not clear that they're doing this. Japan's government is doing this as a single entity to go on this trial. Once you start down the road, from the prosecutor's point of view, they have to they file charges, a trial follows. It's, I think, more happenstance than people sometimes give it credit for. A lot more of it is just the thing got started and now it continues. I think probably the Japanese government is worried about its international reputation on this, but it also feels it can't just reverse course in the middle of a prosecution. We did an event a couple of weeks ago with mainly a Japanese very senior audience, and they were almost completely, incredibly against Ghosn and felt that he had besmirched Japan by leaving the country, that he had basically dismissed the legal system and made it look foolish. And so there was no doubt from those people, many of them, that Ghosn was the guilty person here and the Japanese government should indeed pursue him.
Thank you very much. You referenced the former US ambassador's critical stance on the Japanese justice system. And as I understand it, the UN, in fact, had a commission look at the way that the Ghosn arrest and subsequent incarceration was handled. And as I understand it, it was a very damning report. And to the extent that it actually recommended, if I remember correctly, that certain of the individual prosecutors should themselves be subject to sanction as individuals for having violated the norms of what are considered civilized procedures in terms of justice. So my question really is, to what extent in the process of your research did you find, or to what extent did you feel that Japan Inc. or Japan as a member of global society has been subject to global scrutiny and sanction? To what extent is Japan concerned about that? And more importantly, I think going forward, Ghosn was a internationally recognized executive of some standing, having been successful at Michelin. He was a global participant in a global industry who elected to come to Japan of the various opportunities that presumably presented to him. And finally, he was subject to what may be described as a medieval type of vindictive justice system. And the real key question I think I have is, going forward, to what extent has Japan made it very, very difficult for people who are of that caliber globally, who could choose to come to Japan, who could choose to go to Europe, who could choose to go to the US, just go anywhere, to say, you know what, the risks associated with being in Japan are simply unacceptably high. I will not come to Japan. And to what extent is that to Japan's long-term detriment going forward? Thank you.
Want me to start on that one? There's a lot in there. So you started from the United Nations. It's useful to remember this is not the United Nations, right? It's a committee, it's a working group that issued this report. Yes, they were very, very negative on Japan. No doubt about it, blistering in some of their criticism. The main point of criticism was the long hours of interrogation without a lawyer being present. That's probably the sort of poster child issue for Japan. We talked to prosecutors about this, and they looked and they said, well, of course we have to interrogate them without their lawyers. Otherwise, they won't tell the truth. And they just nodded. I mean, this was not even something for them that was negotiable. I think, however, it may change. And I think the plea bargain system that Japan is bringing in will allow for that change. Because right now, the only way to get a confession, a guilty plea, which is still the case, say, in 90% of American trials, is to basically keep them in custody. There is no plea bargain system to say, okay, we'll give you 5 years if you go ahead and sign here. If they bring that in, that will make it more like Western justice. Now, is that any better or not? I don't know. In terms of the conditions that Ghosn was held in, it is from our reporting and talking to people who have been at Kosuge, the facility in mind. If you've been to Rikers Island, Kosuge doesn't look so bad, right? It's all a matter of relativeness. It's myriad of petty rules, basically to break your spirit, but it's clean, it's safe. There is no inmate to inmate violence. There are no drug lords running the facility, right? So it's more of a mix than that. But is Japan worried? I think so, yes. And I think you'll see change over time when no one's looking, right? Once the heat passes, they'll say, oh, maybe we should allow lawyers in, because now we've got a plea bargain system where we can actually move these cases through quickly.
It's funny that, to what degree is Japan reacting to this, or to what degree is the international community coming down and pressuring Japan? I think there were at moments when Ghosn was here and making a lot of noise about it, and especially after his escape, there was a lot of pressure on Japan. At the time, the justice minister at the time, Mori, had a press conference to address this issue of international scrutiny. And she said, she criticized Ghosn for escaping and said that, well, if he really wants to clear his name, he should come back here and prove his innocence. And that's kind of anathema to the almost exact opposite of the Western approach, which is the prosecutors have to prove his guilt, not that he has to prove his innocence. And she said that, and it was just indicative of the kind of the different mindset of the Japanese justice system here. And that brought out a lot of scrutiny against Japan, because it was kind of like, wow, they really said that out loud, didn't they? And
she did apologize for that.
She did apologize for it, but only after she was criticized for it. Yeah, we have that kind of that kind of mindset here, and that came out there. Also, I might say, as another point of Japan's reaction to the international community, ahead of the start of the trial of Greg Kelly, where there was still a lot of criticism about this case in the international media, which has died down more now. But ahead of his case, which started on his birthday in September 15th, 2020, the Justice Ministry had a big briefing in English to talk about the Japanese justice system. And it was a very rare occasion when they opened it to the international media and had it all in English. And this was simply to try to explain and defend the Japanese justice system on the global stage. So they are sensitive about it, and they are reacting to it. I was still unclear as to what degree they're actually going to make any lasting or significant changes.
We've got time for about 2 more questions.
Thank you for the talk. In the process of writing and researching, could you describe how your thinking changed, kind of the waves or the stages, kind of the contours, going left, going right, please?
This seems like the hardest question of the evening. How did our thinking change?
I don't know. Were we thinking? I guess we were. Yeah.
Well, I would say this, that when we started out, it was early 2020 when we started writing this book, actually. And it was an agent in the United States came to William actually first and approached William and said, well, hey, this was right after Ghosn escaped, by the way, and it was huge news worldwide. Everybody was like, oh my gosh, did you hear about that guy in Japan? He escaped in a box, man. And so it was huge news. It was very bombastic. It was like made for Hollywood caper. And an agent approached William about, hey, would you be able to write a book about this? And
so I went to Hans.
Yeah, so,
Hans, write a book. I'll help.
So, my good fortune, William approached me to join him on this escapade. And at the beginning, there were still lots of, the hardest part was that nobody wanted to talk about it because everybody was scared. Nobody wanted to talk. And if they did talk to you, they didn't want to use their names or their titles or any way that they could be identified as talking about it. And at the time, there were a lot of things that were still unknown. Like we didn't have a clear picture about what had happened or with Ghosn and the 8 years at the helm, or with Ghosn and the escape. There were just so many questions at the time. But over the period, even up until very today, actually, with Kelly's trial, more of that came into focus. And I wish we had just kind of started writing later because let's say within the past 6 months or the last year or so, 2021, more of the people that you see that we talk to are now coming out and talking openly and with their names in the record, in the public domain. And it's kind of aggravating because, man, how come you hid your name with us? How come you insisted we couldn't use your name? And now you're out there talking publicly. But I think you're going to see a lot more information come to the surface here that's going to help flesh out the picture of what actually happened. And I think that was probably the biggest adjustment, trying to keep up with all the new information that was flooding in at the last minute as time went by.
Yeah, I think we took it from actually a reporter's perspective. I didn't have a vision or a view of the conclusion of the book when we started. And both of us started at the beginning, right? We sort of divided up the chapters. We started at the beginning of the book, and then by the time we got to the end, that's when we started on the conclusion, looking at everything we had done and say, okay, where are we? And we actually hadn't talked about the information that much back and forth because it was factual information that we were trying to get to. And then how do we sum it up? What's the conclusion? And that was, a lot of discussion, but it didn't come until the end, really.
Thank you. And our final question comes from another virtual attendee. This is from Yuichiro. William and Hans, what impact do you think this case has had and will have on relations between Japan and France in business, finance, investment, M&A, etc.? Will the two governments be able to keep the case separate as an extraordinary item outside of normal ongoing links? The recent AUKUS deal with Australia snubbing France, allegedly helping Japanese submarine-related manufacturers in the process, also relates.
Another big tab. We're over to Australian submarines. Thank you, Yuricho. That's I don't think I have great insights into the workings between the French and the Japanese governments and whether they will continue or what their relations are like. It's clear this was a big issue for both sides. No doubt about that. Macron raised it with Abe at a meeting that they had. So it's been a big issue. I think it partly depends on how they're going to get out of this. What's the resolution? According to one financial analyst, here's a thought just very quickly. If the two merge and you take out the French government shareholding, actually Nissan shareholders would end up with more than half the company, which is certainly not what the French government has in mind for an outcome. So the whole merger idea, we kept asking, it was never very clear. What's this going to look like financially? Who owns what in this case? Who pays what to whom, and what's it going to look like? So that's still to be determined as well, I think. Final word over to you.
Well, I just go back to the French government idea and the idea of actually foreign companies coming here to work with, especially automotive companies. There's not a great history or track record of foreign auto companies matching up with Japanese companies and automakers and being a long-term success. Actually, the Renault-Nissan alliance is the poster child for the closest thing to there was being a success. And Ghosn at its helm up until 2018 showed that it could be done and showed that it could be successful, and that they could be, that they had this appearance of amity, that they were working together and really thriving, not just getting by, but thriving. But that stood in really big contrast to the history of Japanese auto cooperation. We're looking at, General Motors had operations here, and they had tie-ups with Suzuki and Subaru, and those went basically went into nothing. Isuzu too, I think, at one point. Ford came in here with Mazda, and they were successful for a while, but eventually Ford pulled out as well. And Mazda was happy with that. And the worst case probably to remember was Volkswagen and Suzuki. And, they tied up, and again, it was a matter of control. The Japanese really bristled under the idea that Volkswagen was claiming it as a subsidiary of Volkswagen. And that set off alarm bells inside Suzuki, and they were like, whoa, we can't have any of this. We're an independent company. This is just a cooperation agreement. And they had this very messy breakup, and the Suzuki called Volkswagen a, quote, ball and chain and a bone in its throat. And that was another messy breakup. So there's not a great history of this international cooperation here. And now what you see is really a kind of a all Japan coalition going on here. And you see Nissan combining with Mitsubishi. Just on the, even if they get rid of Renault, you at least have Nissan and Mitsubishi working together. That's a pretty sizable company. Then on the other side, you have Toyota, which is the grand national champion, the biggest company, automaker in the world. Now it's kind of sucking up or sweeping up all the smaller companies. So it has now cross shareholdings with Suzuki, with Mazda, with Subaru, with Hino, and of course Daihatsu. Those are already consolidated. But you see how it's creating this other kind of grand all Japan team and protecting all these smaller players. And then you have Honda, which is this kind of middle-sized player all by itself, and but it's at least Honda, and it has a, it has solid earnings and a global following. So you have these kind of three camps now in the Japan auto industry, and I think that's by design. They want to keep the Japan government and the Japan public has an interest in keeping a strong automotive industry here because it's an anchor of the economy. It's one of the few sectors where Japan's global competitiveness still reigns supreme, as we see things like electronics and other industries go down the tubes here. So that is one sector that Japan is basically hell-bent on protecting.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, William.